The Anglo-American mathematician turned philosopher Alfred North Whitehead and the French paleontologist turned philosopher theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, two prominent thinkers in the first half of the 20th century, developed dynamic and innovative metaphysical views of the God-world relationship. Teilhard, in his major work, The Phenomenon of Man, has a teleological and theistic outlook. The evolutionary cosmic process with the divine universal involvement, particularly the evolution of the noosphere, is directed towards differentiated union in the risen Christ, the omega point, a culmination of all consciousnesses into a pleroma of supreme consciousness. Whitehead, in his magnum opus, Process and Reality, emphasizes the diversity and multiplicity of nature in the growth of a complexly structured society, self-constituted by actual occasions, which, according to him, are the final real things of which the world is made up. The cosmic process for Whitehead is teleological and infinite. God and the world are in an eternal polarity of dialectical relationship. There can be no doubt that their respective understandings of the God-world relationship clearly differ. Nevertheless, my claim is that a revision and combination of the views on the God-world relationship within the metaphysical schemes of Teilhard and Whitehead can serve to develop a metaphysical panentheistic view of the intersubjective God-world relationship. Panentheism. Panentheism simply means all in Godism. According to Charles Hartshorne, an American process philosopher, panentheism views that, I quote, all things are within the being of God, who yet is not merely the whole of actual things, end of quote. In other words, though the world is in God ontologically, God and the world are ontologically, both in essence and existence, distinct, and the being of God transcends the world. Thus, panentheism has exemplified a middle path between two extremes in the doctrine of God, namely classical theism, which claims that God is in the world, but the world is not in God, and pantheism, in which God is identified with the world and the world is identified with God. In his Three Varieties of Panentheism, Niels Henrik Gregersen, a professor of science and theology at the University of Aarhus in Denmark, gives a two-layered generic definition of panentheism. First, God contains the world, yet is also more than the world. Accordingly, the world is, in some sense, in God. Second, as contained in God, the world not only derives its existence from God, but also returns to God, while preserving the characteristics of being a creature. Accordingly, the relations between God and the world are, in some sense, bilateral. End of quote. It is quite obvious that Gregersen's definition underscores a necessary interdependence between God and the world. Nevertheless, as he himself has pointed out in his article, the difficulty is to determine the proviso in some sense in both the world's being in God and in the mutual relation between God and the world. Evidently, like all such revolutionary terms, panentheism has not been welcomed without controversy. Even given the initial attractiveness of the notion of panentheism, that is, of the idea that creation somehow exists within God, it is not at all clear how this is to be understood. So the crucial debate has centered on the meaning of "n" in panentheism. The little word "in" is the hinge of it all. In addition, Gregerson is of the opinion that the concept of panentheism is not stable in itself. For there may be as many panentheisms as there are ways of qualifying the world's being in God. So the central question is, in what sense does the universe exist in God? Furthermore, one of the difficulties of understanding panentheism, the world's being in God, arises if we explain it in terms of substance metaphysics. I think that panentheism requires a dynamic terminology that expresses the notion of a milieu of communion and relationality rather than substance, a relatively closed and static concept that denotes something as self-subsisting. In the rest of the paper, I attempt to discuss this single idea, namely the dynamic "in" of Teilhard's and Whitehead's panentheism from the perspective of a metaphysics of intersubjectivity. First, I will explore their respective views on the God-world relationship separately, and then, after I highlight how their views are different from each other, I also point out the limitations in their individual approaches. In the last part, I try to sketch how the two approaches might be modified and combined in an all-encompassing intersubjective process, panentheism. Teilhard's pleromic God-world relationship. Though Teilhard never used the term panentheism, his writings portray a reciprocal interaction between God and the world. Ian G. Barbour, one of the early scholars who compared Teilhard and Whitehead in the 1960s, notes that Teilhard criticizes classical theism, which makes the world too useless and ontologically superfluous for God. Therefore, rejecting the paternalism of the classical view, Teilhard, in his essay, The Stuff of the Universe, calls the relation between God and the world a functional completing of the one and the multiple. There are a number of texts which speak of the fulfillment of God, who consummates himself in uniting. Teilhard's panentheism is rooted in his Trinitarian theology. In other words, according to Teilhard, the world's being in God is necessarily being in triune God. Teilhard's ontology of many within the one reflects his metaphysics of union, where he asserts that to be is to unite. Teilhard reaches a profound depth in his thought in expounding a theory of the metaphysics of union in his essay, My Fundamental Vision. I quote, "Being in some way the fruit of a reflection of God, no longer in God, but outside God, outside him, the pleromization emerges as a sort of echo or symmetrical response to trinitization. It somehow fills a gap. It fits in. To create is to unite." End of quote. In other words, according to Teilhard, creation is, so to say, God making space within Trinity to effect the unity of what he calls the multiple. Teilhard further explains that in the process of trinitization, that is, unifying himself upon himself, God stimulates the emergence of another type of opposition at the opposite pole from himself, which Teilhard calls the multiple. Teilhard further notes that God, who is self-subsistent unity, inevitably immerses himself in the multiple, so that he may incorporate it in himself. Therefore, Teilhard's notion of creation is essentially an idea of creation through evolution as one slowly culminating event, a continuous process, even at this moment, which God achieves through a process of what Teilhard calls creative union. In his essay, My Universe, Teilhard explains his theory. I quote, "Creative union is the theory that accepts this proposition. In the present evolutionary phase of the cosmos, the only one known to us, everything happens as though the one were formed by successive unifications of the multiple, and as though the one were more perfect, the more perfectly it centralized under itself as larger multiple." End of quote. Commenting on Teilhard's creative union, Ursula King, Professor Emerita of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, highlights a panentheistic notion built into Teilhard's theory of creative union. She remarks that, I quote, "The many can become one, not through fusion and loss of identity, but through a higher form of union, which enhances individual elements as it unites them at a deeper level." End of quote. But this does not mean that the one is composed of the multiple. Teilhard makes this point very clear when he puts it in My Universe that, I quote, "Creative union does not fuse together the terms which it associates. It preserves the terms. It even completes them." End of quote. Thus, the realization of being through a process of creative union, a union of the multiple within the one, is what Teilhard calls the pleromization of being in the omega, where God and the world will be constituted into an organic complex, the pleroma. In the essay, How I Believe, where he proposes a synthesis of Christ and the universe, Teilhard adopts a pantheism of differentiation. By this, he avoids, on the one hand, the identification of God with the world in the evolutionary process, and on the other, the absorption of creation into God in what he calls the omega point. He argues that it is an illusion to think that the multiple, after the whole process of evolution, be dissolved and lost into the one in the final convergence in the omega, like the grains of salt are dissolved into the sea. So he concludes that at least for the human person, that is the particular center of perceptions and love, I quote, "its own particular way of dissolving is to carry unification still further. For the human monad, fusion with the universe means super-personalization." End of quote. Moreover, he stresses the essentiality of love. For example, in My Fundamental Vision, where he writes that only love can centrically unite all individuals simultaneously in the supremely personalizing omega point. Teilhard calls this a Christian pantheism of differentiation. Barbour summarizes Teilhard's point, saying that, I quote, "Ultimate reality is neither an undifferentiated unity nor an impersonal structure, but a supreme person." End of quote. I think that precisely because of his pantheism of differentiation, which is a pleroma of God all in everyone, Teilhard must be regarded a panentheist. In a certain sense, the differentiating unity of the many in the one is a soteriological panentheistic view. Borrowing the term soteriological panentheism from Gregerson, I see Teilhard's God all in everyone as an eschatological hope. Though according to Teilhard, by participation in matter, and by universal involvement in cosmic history, that is by incarnation, God's relation to the evolutionary world of creation is organic. Yet by the redeeming grace of God, that is by resurrection, the world can fully dwell in God in a differentiated unity only in the final consummation in the cosmic Christ in the Omega. In conclusion, as I see it, the presently ongoing evolutionary process towards the complete Pleroma, in which the embodying immanence of the transcendental God guides the becoming of the world as a temporal process, only signifies that the world is in God already, but not yet. Whitehead's dipolar God-world relationship. The most familiar type of panentheism, dipolar panentheism or dipolar theism, as it is known in process metaphysics, is based on the understanding of the God-world relationship in the philosophy of Whitehead. Although he too does not use the term, there is no doubt that his doctrine of God is conceptually worked out in terms of panentheism. In Process and Reality, Whitehead portrays a sharp distinction between God and the world, which he calls a dipolarity. I quote, "God and the world are the contrasted opposites, and God and the world stand over against each other." End of quote. Nevertheless, all things are in God, and He is in all things. Each temporal occasion embodies God and is embodied in God. Whitehead, in clear terms, expresses that there is a necessary interdependence between God and the world, so that the world contributes to God as much as God contributes to the world. He writes, I quote, "It is as true to say that God is permanent and the world fluent, as that the world is permanent and God is fluent. It is as true to say that God is one and the world many, as that the world is one and God many. It is as true to say that God transcends the world as that the world transcends God. It is as true to say that God creates the world as that the world creates God." End of quote. Summarizing these thoughts, Gregerson points out that, I quote, "It is by a metaphysical necessity that God and world coexist and co-determine one another, so that God influences the world and temporal experiences flow into the actual nature of God. All that exists necessarily participates in divine life." End of quote. Furthermore, the key to understand God's relation to the world lies in Whitehead's dipolar concept of God. In other words, the dipolarity between God and the world is essentially linked to the dipolarity between the two natures of the one and the same God. In part 5 of Process and Reality, Whitehead says, I quote, "The nature of God is dipolar. He has a primordial nature and a consequent nature. The consequent nature of God is conscious, and it is the realization of the actual world in the unity of His nature and through the transformation of His wisdom. The primordial nature is conceptual. The consequent nature is the weaving of God's physical feelings upon His primordial concepts." End of quote. In other words, God's primordial nature includes all ideal possibilities. His consequent nature prehends the entire universe of actual occasions and their entire past. Nevertheless, since God and the world are at opposite poles of the cosmic process, what connects or links them together are, as Whitehead terms them, the metaphysical givens or principles of creativity and extensive continuum. According to Whitehead, I quote, "Creativity achieves its supreme task of transforming disjoined multiplicity with its diversities in opposition into concrescent unity, with its diversities in contrast." End of quote. Whitehead asserts that, I quote again, "God is the aboriginal instance of this creativity and is therefore the aboriginal condition which qualifies its action." End of quote. Moreover, together with creativity, the extensive continuum interlinks God and the finite world. According to Whitehead, the extensive continuum is a relational complex of all actual entities, past, present, and future. I quote, "united by the various allied relationships of whole to part, and of overlapping so as to possess common parts, and of contact, and of other relationships derived from these primary relationships." End of quote. Thus, in the context of the God-world relationship, creativity and extensive continuum can be understood, on the one hand, as vital principles for the ground of both divine being and all finite actual entities, and on the other hand, as necessary conditions for the dynamic interrelation between all actual entities, including God as the primordial actual entity in the organic universe as a whole. Finally, we can say that Whitehead's dipolar panentheism essentially claims not simply the world's being in God, but the mutual dependence of God and the world. Moreover, despite God's dependence on the world, the dipolar panentheism preserves both the essential, eternal nature of God and the essentially temporal process of God's relation to the world. Commenting on this point, Philip Clayton, a professor of philosophy and religion at the Claremont Graduate University, further points out that dipolar panentheism suggests a more dialectical answer. Not, I quote, "not unity or difference, but unity indifference. The world is neither indistinguishable from God nor fully ontologically separate from God." End of quote. Thus, in conclusion, I think that in the case of Whitehead's dipolar panentheism, the world is in God always and never. The complementarity of Teilhard's Pleroma and Whitehead's polarity. From the above sketches, it is quite evident that Teilhard's Pleroma and Whitehead's polarity are very different from each other. On a positive note, there are quite a few striking similarities in their views on the God-world relationship. First and foremost, they both oppose dualism in all aspects of reality and uphold that God and the world constitute one reality. The second common aspiration between them is that they both share an intuition of a two-way relation between God and the world within the inclusive reality of God. Thirdly, we see a similarity between Teilhard and Whitehead with regard to the dialectical dynamics operative within God vis-a-vis the God-world relationship. In other words, the dialectical dynamics operative within God are somehow extended to the God-world relationship. Fourthly, both Teilhard and Whitehead uphold that creation is one and a still continuing process, which has an important implication towards God's relation to the world. Notwithstanding these similarities, there is no doubt that the differences between Teilhard's and Whitehead's outlooks on the God-world relationship are quite enormous, and consequently, their views even look incompatible with each other. I think the dissimilarities are partially due to their style and methodology in crafting their metaphysical systems. Barbour, in his article Teilhard's Process-Metaphysics, points out that while Teilhard uses vivid analogies and poetic images in crafting the God-world relationship, Whitehead employs carefully defined philosophical abstractions. Moreover, while Teilhard views the God-world relationship predominantly from a theological perspective, Whitehead interprets it strictly from a philosophical standpoint. In crafting a theologically upgraded God-world relationship to reconcile modern science and Catholic faith, Teilhard focuses on the unity of the cosmic process as a whole, with an eschatological emphasis on the teleological orientation of the cosmic process to the risen Christ. However, Whitehead's aim as philosopher of science is to deliberately break free from the materialistic determinism of the early modern science, in which reality is composed of bits of matter simply located in space and time, and having purely external relations to one another. Therefore, while underscoring creativity, novelty, and spontaneity as intrinsically inherent features of reality, Whitehead emphasizes diversity and multiplicity in cosmic reality, which is made up of actual occasions. In addition, as Barbour points out, it is interesting to note that though both acknowledge their indebtedness to Bergson, neither of them seem to be familiar with the works of the other. Nonetheless, neither of their views can be considered a foolproof panentheistic system. First, Teilhard, with his eagerness to preserve the individuality of the consciousness of creatures while employing a substance, or rather monad metaphysics, at least terminologically, conceives the world's being in God as the spatio-temporal existence of the collection of indifferent or differentiated grains of consciousness of the human community and perhaps all of material creation in a pleroma, which I think gives the impression that it is taken to be like a container. In addition, Teilhard's understanding of Trinity making space for the created universe is in a danger of ascribing spatiality to God. Moreover, in the final consummation in the omega point, which he explains elaborately in his My Fundamental Vision, Teilhard clearly preserves the individuality of consciousness for human beings in the noosphere, or the collective consciousness of humankind. But he is vague about the non-human world. Second, one of the great weaknesses in Whitehead is to advance dipolar theism with insufficient emphasis on the dialectical nature of the relationship, as Clayton points out. Arguably, while preserving the two-ness of the two poles in God, Whitehead does not attempt to add a third moment or element as the movement of relation between them. Whether it is the two opposing poles as the two natures of God, or God and the world as the two opposing poles of cosmic reality, there is no room for a relational synthesis between the dialectics of the opposition. Moreover, by simply stipulating creativity and extensive continuum as metaphysical givens from which God and the world emerge, Whitehead is in a danger of making God, like any of us, a creature of creativity. Thus, as I see it, both the views of Teilhard and Whitehead need further revision. I suggest that a combination of these two views will produce a process panentheistic picture of the God-world relationship that is more convincing. In the following sections of this paper, I will sketch how to revise Teilhard's and Whitehead's metaphysical approaches along the following lines. 1. Teilhard's tri-personality approach should replace Whitehead's polarity. 2. Whitehead's systems-oriented approach should replace Teilhard's Pleroma. 3. The fields of activity approach should elucidate the God-world relation in both. As we have seen, Teilhard teaches us that God is tripersonal rather than unipersonal. For him, God is not an individual subject of experience in an ongoing dialectical relationship with the world, as in Whitehead's theory, but rather a community of divine relational subjects of experience who make space within their own activity and existence for the emergence of the created universe. Of course, the space metaphor here is not to be understood as spatial continuum from the world to God or vice versa. As Gregerson observes, a creator's space is not based on the created time-space continuum. Rather, the world's spatial temporal existence is opened by and embraced by God's unimaginable roominess. With this revised understanding, Teilhard's panentheistic ontology of many within the one will be a better solution of the problem of relating God to the world than the implicit dialectical dualism which inevitably exists between God and the world in Whitehead. Then indeed, the world of creation exists within God but is still distinct from God in terms of its own finite existence and activity. Further, in the light of Teilhard's dialectical dynamics of relationality within the tripersonality of God, I think we can grasp a better understanding of the tension between the primordial and consequent natures of God. Considering God as relational, his consequent nature somehow arises in his relationship to the world. And in the complexity of this relationship, God, so to say, differentiates himself from the world with his primordial nature. In contrast, a revised notion of the Whiteheadian notion of society can help Teilhard to enhance his understanding of the Pleroma. Whitehead, to be sure, considered societies which are a multiplicity of the nexus of dynamically interrelated actual occasions as enduring objects characterized by a common element of form. However, albeit describing society as environment, Whitehead did not develop the notion of society sufficiently. In his latest book, The World in the Trinity, Open-Ended Systems in Science and Religion, revising Whiteheadian notion of societies, Joseph Bracken, an American process philosopher and Catholic theologian, proposes a system-oriented approach to panentheism. According to Bracken, the cosmic reality is composed of higher-order and lower-order systems within the comprehensive system of divine life. The term system is more comprehensive than societies in Whitehead, since system can be applied to the analysis of individual entities as well as to social or corporate entities. Thus, with the system-oriented approach, the triune God in Teilhard's scheme can be understood as an ongoing process or system whereby the three divine persons are sub-processes or subsystems, forming a divine community or higher-order process or system. With this understanding of process, the analogy of being between God and creatures of classical metaphysics can be turned into an analogy of becoming between God and creatures. Thus, as becoming, the nature of divine community is not in the first place an entity but an activity. Further, Bracken concludes that in this system-oriented paradigm of the one and the many, I quote, one is not understood as higher-order entity as in the classical paradigm, but as a synthesizing activity that links the empirical many with one another in progressively more complex and far-reaching synthesis. End of quote. Additionally, an insight from Bracken which can help to reconcile the Whiteheadian societies and the Teilhardian noosphere is the notion of field instead of the classical substance. Substance metaphysics, if by substance being in its foundational concept is understood as an entity, as generally understood in classical metaphysics, is not compatible with process-panentheism. Instead, I think the notion of field could be a better term to illustrate God and the world not as static entities, but primarily and essentially as relational activities that emerge or manifest as entities. Field, a term taken from quantum physics, where it indicates interactive relations originating in energies or forces, essentially defines relations. And through relations, it enables entities to come about as subjects of experience. Bracken further points out that fields can be layered into overlapping one another without losing their individual identity as different fields of activity. For substances do not change in their substantial form or basic intelligibility. Fields of activities undergo change over time since they are heavily conditioned by the dynamic relations to one another. Thus, Whiteheadian societies can be further understood as systems of structured fields of activity which endure over time while undergoing accidental modifications. Moreover, I think that with the above revised notion of society as a system of structured fields of activity of subjects of experience, Whitehead can help Thea to steer clear of pantheism and assert instead panentheism. Thus, along with the noosphere, the whole of creation as a complex system of created fields of activity is incorporated into the system of the field of activity proper to the divine, the Trinitarian God. Moreover, the goal of cosmic evolution is not just the incorporation of human beings as persons of consciousness, detaching themselves from the material matrix, but in Pauline terms, the whole of creation, the divine milieu, as fields of activity incorporating into the cosmic Christ as members of his mystical body. Finally, I propose that process-panentheism, springing from a system-oriented approach to Thea and Whitehead, with a revised understanding of God and the world, advances a metaphysical theory of intersubjectivity. A metaphysical notion of universal intersubjectivity, as Bracken explains, basically implies a balance between multiplicity and unity, between multiple subjects of experience and the higher order levels of existence and activity, which they achieve by their dynamic interaction of participation and mutuality. In other words, in a metaphysics of intersubjectivity, God and creation are taken to be subjects of experience in a dynamic interrelation of mutuality. The metaphysical notion of universal intersubjectivity, however, is understood in a cosmic rather than merely interpersonal context. In his book, Subjectivity, Objectivity, and Intersubjectivity, A New Paradigm for Religion and Science, Joseph Bracken notes that intersubjectivity is, I quote, both the starting point and the goal for resolving the tension between subjectivity and objectivity, the many and the one, at all the different levels of existence and activity. In Process and Reality, Whitehead comes very close to an intersubjective relationality with this fundamentally relational category of existence, namely prehension. John Cobb, a contemporary process philosopher and theologian, explains this Whiteheadian relational term, saying that, I quote, "The prehension does not change what it prehends, but the subject of the prehension becomes what it becomes through its prehensions," end of quote. Applying this term to the God-world relationship, Bracken comments that God and the world as subjects of experience are internalizing their relations to one another through mutual prehension, I quote, "through mutual prehension and thereby effecting a union with one another deeper than that of a simple aggregate of things, spatially juxtaposed to one another," end of quote. Moreover, according to Christian de Quincey, a professor of the philosophy of consciousness, intersubjectivity in its stronger sense is, I quote, "a process of co-creativity where relationship is ontologically primary. All individuated subjects co-emerge or co-arise as a result of a holistic field of relationships," end of quote. This means that the subjectivity of one entity depends on the subjectivity of all other entities with which the former is in relationship. It follows from this that ultimately any entity depends on all other entities. And in the first place, the said entity is created in the world of relations, which is rooted in the whirlwind that is the trine relational God. In conclusion, we can say that bringing together the Pleroma of Teilhard and the polarity of Whitehead with the system-oriented approach to the God-world relationship, in which the relationship between the whole and the parts is structured in layers of fields of activity, advances an intersubjective process panentheism. In this approach, the Teilhardian collectivity of consciousness and Whiteheadian societies are seen as layered and overlapping relational fields of activity rather than individual self-subsisting entities. Finally, in sincerity, we must accept that Teilhard's pleromic view and Whitehead's dipolar view cannot be merged together, but can be revised and enhanced by the help of each other, to stand next to each other to bring out a coherent understanding of the God-world relationship. Vielen Dank für mir zu hören. Thank you.